sit-ins, protests, freedom rides, bus boycotts. The civil rights movement of the 1960s changed the face of America. However, African Americans had been fighting for their rights long before the movement began. A. Philip Randolph, one such activist, started his career in the 1920s, where he became a leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, an African American labor union. Though he never gained the recognition achieved by other activists like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, he later became known as the grandfather of the civil rights movement. In 1925, while working on his magazine, Randolph received an invitation from a group of veteran sleeping car porters asking him to lead them in their battle as a union against the Pullman Palace Car Company. The Pullman Company revolutionized the railroad industry in the middle of the 19th century. They became the largest employer of African Americans across the nation. Throughout his early career, Randolph worked alongside these African Americans, entitled the Pullman Porters. Pullman Porters were the pillars of the black community. They were generally well-spoken and fought for the advancement of their race. Their job allowed them to marry, buy a home, and raise a family. But regardless of these benefits, the porters were often away from home. The Pullman Company required all porters to work either 400 hours every month or clock in 11,000 miles. Due to these outrageous conditions, it wasn't long before the porters started to rebel against the monopoly of the Pullman Company, forming the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The porters were in need of a leader like Randolph, whose journey as a strong civil rights advocate was just beginning. Formed in 1925, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, through the influential leadership of A. Philip Randolph, was able to successfully push for porter rights against the monopoly of the Pullman Company. The legacy of the original mission pursued by the Brotherhood allowed Randolph to rise to a position of power in the black community and organize and unify the March on Washington, leading to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. After becoming president of the Union, Randolph was quick to spread the message of the porters. He assigned Milton P. Webster, an ex-porter living in Chicago, to become the vice president of the Union. Together, they organized meetings across all the major Pullman terminals, including Chicago and New York. The number of porters that were part of the Union quickly grew, well over 2,000. To stop the growing brotherhood, the Pullman Company began firing porters by the masses. Within weeks, hundreds of porters had been let off the job. Still, the brotherhood did not give up. Though it was forced to move underground, knowledge of the Union was still spreading across the country. Regardless, the Brotherhood had not yet been rewarded for its efforts. Porters were still under the abuse of passengers, still weren't allowed to sleep on most nights, and still had to rely on the passengers' tips to make a living. But one thing had been made clear: the porters were willing and strong enough to fight back. However, the passing years led to more failures. Randolph even brought his claims against the company to a mediation board, but the company refused to negotiate and continued to deny that the Brotherhood represented the porters. The board couldn't do anything more, and once again, the company remained the victor. Defeat was harsh. Anti-Randolph feelings were beginning to rise, with many porters thinking that he wasn't the right leader to represent them against the Pullman Company. But this was only the start. The Great Depression was approaching, and soon, everything would fall apart. By the turn of the decade, the Great Depression was in full swing. Poverty struck the country, leaving millions homeless and without food. But the Depression was even worse for the Brotherhood. Membership reached an all-time low, and many of the district offices were forced to close.
The Brotherhood was a poor, beleaguered organization that seemed to produce no results up against the Pullman Company. And so Randolph held this organization together really by faith, a belief that someday, somehow, they would prevail and they would usher in a new day, one that not only improved the economic dimensions of the job, raise wages, reduce hours, that sort of thing, but that would bring a modicum of dignity to Pullman porters who experienced indignity.
But even so, in the darkest hour, hope was not lost. In 1932, President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced a series of acts called the New Deal to revive the dwindling U.S. economy. These acts outlawed company unions and any sort of company influence within a union. Many porters rejoined the Brotherhood, seeing that there was no fear of getting fired for doing so. By 1934, after 9 years of hard work, the company had to come to the negotiating table. In 1935, Randolph finally sat down in the Pullman offices with the other Brotherhood leaders to begin 2 years of negotiations. By August 25, 1937, exactly 12 years after the Brotherhood had been formed, Randolph's persistent organizing and commitment paid off. The porters' hours were dramatically reduced, from 400 to 240 a month, and the porters were given the largest pay raise they'd ever received, a total of $175. The immediate impact of such an agreement was enormous within the black community. African Americans were now willing to support Randolph, as they saw his success as a chance to put right all the years of mistreatment they had faced. Though the Union continued to operate, Randolph, its leader, had stepped onto a larger stage. In 1941, the Brotherhood gathered porters and other individuals to hold a march on Washington to improve employment practices toward African Americans in the defense industry. By holding the threat of holding such a march, Roosevelt agreed to pass Executive Order 8802 instead.
During World War II, to protest discrimination in hiring in manufacturing plants that were making war materials, Randolph organized a bunch of groups threatening Roosevelt that they would march on the Capitol to protest hiring discrimination. And at the last minute, Roosevelt caved and issued an executive order banning discrimination in defense hiring, creating something called the Fair Employment Practices Commission. And they held hearings all over the country shaming companies that had allowed discrimination.
But Randolph didn't stop there. In 1948, he pressed forth his belief that segregation in the armed forces should be banned. Soon enough, re-elected President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981. This banned all segregation within the armed services and marked another victory for the African American people.
We needed a catalyst, someone to speak out and work for change and to get things moving. And that catalyst was A. Philip Randolph. I think Americans are better off today because of Randolph's hard work and dedication.
All this was the immediate impact of Randolph gaining popularity as the leader of the Brotherhood within the black community. But later, in the 1960s, Randolph and his colleagues reached a platform much higher than any group advocating for racial equality had ever reached. They came together in admirable fashion, rallying relentlessly for their cause. In 1963, they organized the March on Washington, featuring Martin Luther King Jr. and his sensational I Have a Dream speech. After many leaps and bounds, they'd gotten nationwide attention. Randolph described the synergy in his speech.
Let the nation and the world know the meaning of our numbers. We are not a pressure group. We are not an organization or a group of organizations. We are not a mob. We are the advance guard of a massive moral revolution for jobs and freedom.
Soon after, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were passed by Congress. These acts enforced desegregation within all public facilities and schools, allowing all African Americans to receive the quality of education received by whites. Furthermore, by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, all forms of state disenfranchisement were deemed illegal, including methods to prevent African Americans from putting their vote on the ballot. Today, these acts are looked upon as some of the most important legislations passed in all of American history. Nevertheless, racial tensions still exist across America. In recent years, these have sparked fierce race riots that have captivated the nation. But Randolph's work was not in vain. Modern civil rights groups have carried on his legacy. Groups like the NAACP, which worked alongside Randolph, carry on the fight for racial equality through persistent and committed activism. From Pullman porters to civil rights activists, from the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters to the NAACP, from an oppressed minority to the pillars of racial equality, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and A. Philip Randolph led the movement to fracture the barriers of racial inequality placed upon African Americans many years ago. They paved the way for the advancement of civil rights in not only the workplace, but across America and the world. Their positive example of unfaltering leadership laid the foundation for a better America, today and the future.